In this week's episode of Bleach, the 1,000-Year Blood War arc, Ichigo battles Uryū in a showdown at the Royal Palace. Uryū reveals the true form of his Quincy Vollständig, and Yhwach completely absorbs the Soul King. I'll be honest, as we kick off this full spoiler review and discussion for episode 30 of the 1,000-Year Blood War arc anime titled The Betrayer, well, I'm running out of things to say. My vocabulary only stretches so far. How many more times and in how many myriad ways can I reiterate just how incredible a job the anime is doing right now? I know everyone out there, all of you watching, is feeling the same way. The community feels very united right now, and that's fantastic. We're getting what we want. I'm getting what I wanted, and it's wonderful to watch it play out each week. At least on a macro level, it really does feel like Kubo and the team know exactly what the arc needed in order to fulfill its potential, and be the very best final arc it can be. To this end, episode 30 continues the exciting trend found throughout part 3 so far, where approximately half of each episode's runtime consists of entirely new content. Meaning that even for old-timer manga readers like myself, these new episodes are chock full of surprises that make them an absolute joy to watch. But really, what am I even talking about? This week's episode at long last made good on what's felt like a promise for some time now, and a core piece of the 1,000-Year Blood War arc puzzle that's been missing for over 10 years has at last been filled in. Ichigo versus Uryū. It might seem a little trite. Just because Uryū is now an antagonist, do we really need him to fight Ichigo just for the sake of it? Just to say it's been done, to tick that box and call it a day? No, and that's never what it was all about. Sure, to actually see them fight in a fierce and painful way is undoubtedly exciting, but it's that core visual of the two of them clashing that encapsulates the very crux of the conflict here. Much in the same way Yamamoto's ancient battle with Yhwach is the foundation for the war that stretches across a millennium, Ichigo versus Uryū feels like the new face of that grudge, no matter what's really going on behind the scenes. I've said it before that Uryū turning evil feels like the fulfillment of a plotline that was long since abandoned. Rightfully so, too, for the sake of the character many years ago. Now though, thanks to the anime, we are getting to see that potential route fleshed out, almost like a twisted what-if scenario right before our eyes. For the vast majority of the story, Uryū is the Quincy. When you thought of Quincy, you thought of Uryū. And while Ichigo is a hybrid of all the races, again, for the majority of the story, he's been the face of the Shinigami, of their role as protectors of the world. To take Uryū down this path and commit to it feels like the very believable continuation of their rivalry from the Substitute arc, only ratcheted up to 11. You could have easily called this episode Quincy Archer Hates You and made it a direct sequel to that early confrontation, and I wouldn't have thought twice about it. We wanted this because it makes sense to have it. It's like watching the very idea behind the 1,000-Year Blood War arc blossoming and unfolding in front of us, and it is so good to finally see it. But enough of that for now, we've got a review to dive into. So as we begin our in-depth spoiler review and discussion of the 1,000-Year Blood War arc, episode 30, The Betrayer, as always, I'll be looking at this episode from the perspective of someone who has read all of the 1,000-Year Blood War arc before, meaning there will be potential spoilers for the entire arc to follow, as we take a look at this episode to see what it added, what it changed, and even what it took away from the source material. However guys, before we get started, once you are done with the video, if you enjoyed it and you want to stay up to date with me and my channel, make sure to hit the subscribe button now down below, as it really does help and I really do appreciate it so very much. Alright, so as usual, let's kick things off by taking a look at what this episode covered in regards to the source material. And it's a familiar sight. In a true showcase of just how much the pacing has changed, once again, we are mostly looking at the exact same chapters as were featured in episode 29. In fact, I think we technically only move one chapter forward. It sounds glacial, but the serious restructuring going on here means that the plot is actually progressing nicely, while the actual showdown itself in the palace gets some much-needed time to breathe. But it's clear that big changes are coming even now. As we reach the end of this episode, things are looking quite a bit different to how they do in the manga. So, without further ado, these are the chapters covered in episode 30. First up, we have chapter 617, Return of the God, chapter 618, The Dark Arm, chapter 619, The Betrayer, the title of the episode, chapter 620, Where Do You Stand? And then very tiny snippets, glimpses, from chapter 621, The Dark Curtain, and yes, even chapter 626, The Holy Newborn. Well, as you can see, mostly the same chapters as last week, but we are inching forward ever so slowly every single time. But that doesn't mean that we are totally done with the older chapters either, as major plot points, as I've discussed already from chapters 613 to chapter 617 or so, are still likely to reappear in the future. One thing I want to bring up briefly before we get going with the spoiler analysis itself is the way the newfound pacing is likely to affect Ichigo. Here in the anime, Ichigo has had a proper round 2 showdown with Yhwach, the kind he never really received in the manga at all, meaning we have a much better indication of where Ichigo currently stands in relation to his enemy. I think I might have mentioned it last week, but I am working on an Ichigo-specific video that I'm hoping to release soon, but it's safe to say this general thought will play into it a bit more. But I like that it's now much easier to track Ichigo's progression in the anime. It feels a lot more natural. He's already grown so much from when we last saw him battle the Quincy King in episode 7, and if they don't face off again now until the final battle of Core 4, which I think is likely, then Ichigo will have had plenty of time to continue growing as well. Although, admittedly, he won't be undergoing any training from this point onwards, unless there's another seismic addition to the story, which at this point, I'm not ruling out. And this episode helps to cement that idea too by showing us how Ichigo performs against an Uryū that is frankly considerably more capable than we've ever thought possible. Certainly the Uryū in the manga never feels as strong as the version we are seeing right now, and we'll get into that a bit more later in the video. Speaking of which, let's dive into the spoiler analysis for the 1000-Year Blood War arc episode 30 titled The Betrayer, featuring a battle that's been both long awaited and a long time coming. So, the episode opens with an unexpected recap of events that happened last week, which was a little disappointing. The recap solely focuses on Ukitake and Mimihagi, as if you'd somehow already forgotten the biggest thing to ever happen to this character, but I presume it was done because Mimihagi itself plays a slightly bigger role in this episode. But still, it felt pointless to retread old ground here, but there you go. On the plus side, it really wasn't a particularly long recap. And so, by the time the recap is over, we find ourselves heading back up towards the royal palace, following the shadowy, elongated arm of Mimihagi itself up and through the very core building itself. As mentioned in my reaction, I like the attention to detail here, showing the crater in the base of the palace through which Yhwach blasted Ichigo during episode 28. Interestingly though, Mimihagi itself is shown to be able to completely pass through the building, which I guess was to be expected, but it's cool nonetheless. As the episode truly begins, we find ourselves in chapter 617, as Yhwach realises that because his almighty wasn't able to foresee this shadowy hand's intervention, then Mimihagi must be Reio himself. While never explicitly confirmed, this idea that Yhwach's otherwise all-powerful ability can't see the actions of Reio led to the theory that there is a hierarchy of sorts when it comes to the Almighty, likely based on the number of irises each wielder has. As the only being with a total of 4 irises per eye, it was believed that Adnias had the ultimate form of the Almighty capable of superseding the rest, a theory that I still subscribe to, as it just makes sense to me. Of course, considering Mimihagi is an actual part of Reio, or at least was, then that power extends to the right and presumably left arms as well. This does raise an interesting question about the future of the arc, however. If Uryū does indeed have the Almighty, or a portion of its power at least, then I think a lot of us have started to believe that is how Uryū will land his fateful shot at the end of the final battle, bypassing Yhwach's ability to see and change the future. And yet, Uryū isn't Reio. So where does he sit on this so-called hierarchy, if it even exists? Or is it as simple as those with the Almighty can't see other Almighty wielders in their future sight? After all, Yhwach and Hashwolf never wield the power at the same time, so there's no way of gleaning the answer from there. Anyway, everyone is shocked to learn that this strange apparition is in fact the Soul King himself. Yhwach, enraged by this seeming betrayal, snarls at Mimihagi, asking why the right arm is interfering with the will of the Soul King himself, before concluding that it's grown attached to the Soul Society after all this time. Demanding an answer from the right arm, Yhwach bellows at it, only for Mimihagi to open its single eye in a dramatic stare down, swiveling its gaze and affixing it upon Yhwach himself, as if to challenge him directly. It's an awesome little moment. While the dialogue is right out of chapter 617, the reveal of Mimihagi's eye in this way is new, with the hand opening its eye immediately in the original chapter. After the opening, we return to this scene. In a new dialogue sequence, Yhwach tells us once again that the left arm of the Soul King controls advancement, while the right arm controls stillness, and that as a result, the right arm's sudden appearance means the Soul King must be clinging to life by a thread. This new line is intriguing to me for one specific reason. Yhwach's words here seem to imply that the Soul King and Mimihagi are working in unison towards the shared goal of keeping Adnias alive in some form, when the manga seems to almost explicitly state that Mimihagi is working independently of Adnias and his true desire, after having been separated from the core body for so long. Anyway, as Yhwach approaches Mimihagi, Ichigo cries out for him to stop, and seems to be being actively held back by Yhwach's Reiatsu, which is still coursing through him. In response, Yhwach casually unleashes a strange shockwave, the likes of which we've never seen, which envelops everyone in the vicinity momentarily, coating everything in a peculiar visual filter for just a moment as it washes over them. Ichigo and the others are seemingly paralysed by this power, and I have to imagine that this is just meant to be Yhwach exerting his Reiatsu, but what's weird about it is that we've never seen this particular effect before. And to be honest, if it is supposed to be him exerting his power, then I don't know why they didn't just use the old effect from the anime that everyone is already familiar with. We're treated to a very cool new shot of Yhwach ominously marching towards the Soul King's shattered crystal before we find ourselves in chapter 618, Yhwach proclaiming that he never imagined the Soul King would stand in his way. Engulfing his hand in a ball of brilliant blue flame, Yhwach attempts to obliterate Mimihagi, thrusting his fiery palm towards the black hand. However, Mimihagi generates a shield for itself, deflecting Yhwach's attack and sending the flames streaking outwards into the sky. Visually, this scene interests me a lot. It's quite different from the original chapter, yet essentially the same. In chapter 618, Yhwach attempts to grab Mimihagi with his bare hand, no flame or anything of the sort, but Mimihagi blocks him by spewing a column of shadow upwards from the ground by Yhwach's own feet. Here in the anime, it is a much more brutal head-on collision. Also, I have to wonder, when it comes to Mimihagi's shield in the anime, is the resemblance to Orihime's ability intentional, or just the anime's blanket way of depicting a barrier in this sense? But as the two clash, Yhwach's flames billow from the gaping hole in the palace roof as Yoruichi, in another new piece of dialogue, wonders if Mimihagi really is Reio's actual right arm. It's small, but all of these tiny moments of confirmation via a third party really add up. Back in the day, a lot of the lore surrounding the Soul King and Yhwach was very obtuse, and required a lot of reading between the lines to truly understand. Which is fine for the most part, but when it comes to the anime, I think this is a much better approach. The mystery of the Soul King is intact, but moments of clarity in the form of brief sentences and thoughts like those that Yoruichi is experiencing help to tie everything together for the viewer. Anyway, Yhwach's next line was initially a little confusing to me, and I think it is worded poorly in this particular translation. As he tries to break through Mimihagi's defenses, Yhwach says, "I don't understand. Why would one who can foresee the future try to interfere with his right arm?" Reading it aloud like that makes it clear that it does make sense, but initially I thought Yhwach was referring to Adnias trying to tamper with his own right arm. In actuality, though, Yhwach is wondering why Adnias would use Mimihagi to interfere when he can see the future, and when Yhwach kind of thought they were on the same page. So Yhwach thought that Adnias was wielding Mimihagi himself initially, and only now comes to the realization that actually Mimihagi has seemingly gained a will of its own. As Yhwach moves to destroy Mimihagi, Ichigo suddenly roars, and through sheer physical force, he uses his own blute to expel Yhwach's Reiatsu from his arm, at last freeing himself and dropping the Quincy King's sword. This is an awesome new moment. In the original story, Yhwach's Reiatsu just kind of retracts back into the sword out of nowhere, but here it really feels like the anime is channeling Ichibei through Ichigo. Of course, Ichibei didn't use blute to rid himself of Yhwach's invasive power, but the execution and imagery of the two of them forcing it out through sheer power is very similar. Now free to move without Yhwach's influence, Ichigo appears between him and his father, grabbing Yhwach's arm and pushing it back, dispelling the Quincy King's attack at the same time. This whole sequence is present in the source material too, where I always thought it was drawn a little awkwardly. To be honest, I thought this moment might actually have been cut, or at least dramatically changed up, but actually the following section of the episode sticks to the original chapter 618 fairly faithfully. But it's different in the sense that here in the anime, Ichigo moves fast enough to both free himself from Yhwach's power and block his enemy's attack in the space it took for Yhwach to bring his hand towards Mimihagi, which is another low-key but impressive way of showing Ichigo's current skill level. As Yhwach questions why Ichigo continues to stand in his way, Yoruichi blitzes past them and sets up a Kido seal, placing 3 individual talismans upon the ground around the Soul King before drawing a pattern of light with her fingertips to complete the ritual. Again, this is the same as it appears in the original chapter, though I don't think the 3 distinct seals were actually given names in the manga. Here they are identified as Chiseimon, Teshimon, and Kozanmon, and later one of the episode keycards goes into even further detail about the spell, calling it Sankotsu no Jufu, with each of the 3 talismans designed to resemble a stake on a beast's body. Fangs, horns, and a beak, and thanks to Neonzel for the translation. Yoruichi notes that by grabbing hold of Reio, this strange black arm appears to have stabilised the Soul Society, so for now, they will preserve it exactly the way it is as the new Soul King. As she says this, she finalizes the incantation, and the Soul King, Mimihagi and all, are sealed within a reishi construct. Yoruichi instructs Ichigo to hold Yhwach back, and now with use of both of his arms, Ichigo takes his blade, swings it back, and prepares to unleash a massive Getsuga Tensho. However, before he can finish, Yhwach conjures up one of his giant arrows and attempts to strike Ichigo, another plume of blue flame erupting into the sky. In another slightly subtle showcase of Ichigo's current skill, he's shown to be able to react quick enough to cancel his attack and block Yhwach's sudden strike and defend himself, remaining almost completely unharmed despite being hit at point-blank range. As Yoruichi mockingly tells Yhwach that the future he saw will never come to pass, a fairly large chunk of both the ending of chapter 618 and the start of chapter 619 is cut from the episode. In the manga, the end of chapter 618, Ichigo is actually successful in unleashing his Getsuga Tensho, at which point he and Yhwach then have a discussion about Ichigo's Quincy blood, wherein Yhwach notes that it's up to his eyes whether or not Ichigo does what Yhwach wishes. With the ending of this episode being what it is, it seems unlikely that this moment will ever show up again. Yhwach continues on in chapter 619, telling Ichigo in a very Aizen-like fashion that every battle he's fought, every power he's received to date, was all for the purpose of eventually taking Reio's life in front of Yhwach's eyes. As I mentioned a couple of weeks ago, I think it was now, a much shorter, condensed version of this moment is included in episode 28 when Ichigo cuts down the Soul King, and I speculated then that they might remove all of this, and it seems like they have. I wonder if they felt it was a little too similar to Aizen's big reveal at the end of the Fate Karakura Town arc, having yet another big bad espouse how he somehow influenced absolutely everything Ichigo has done up until now. However, returning back to the episode and the original manga, Ichigo brings his blade down upon Yhwach's bare arm, the Quincy King blocking it in a similar fashion to how Roid blocked Kenpachi's blade in the first invasion, and how Roid tried to block Yamamoto's sword a little later. Yamamoto, by the way, being the only one to successfully injure the target as a result. Though I will point out here that Yhwach is actively using Blute Vein to defend himself from Ichigo. As Ichigo tells Yhwach that he will protect everyone by stopping him, Yhwach wonders why Ichigo keeps saying he'll stop him. In a great, hard-hitting moment taken straight from the original chapter, Yhwach muses that the fact Ichigo can't say he'll kill the man who killed his mother is a sign of Ichigo's weakness. Just like in chapter 619, this is a powerful little exchange. This is the first time anyone has acknowledged Masaki's fate outside of Everything But the Rain, and it's being brought up here by none other than the culprit himself. I agree that Ichigo is made to look weak here, but I think that's by design. Yhwach completely catches him off guard by mentioning Masaki, but what's more interesting is that Yhwach knows he killed her. In the manga, we've seen before that the Vandenreich are somehow aware of who Yhwach has killed in the past, such as when Haschwalth confronts Uryū over Katagiri's death, but it's an interesting prospect to think about. Now, the Alsvalen is specifically a selection of Quincy's that Yhwach himself considers to be unclean, so I guess through his connection to every Quincy via their blood, he can just pick and choose from Quincy even across the world, and knows the names and faces of every Quincy he chooses to purge. This is a little off topic, but there is one thing I think we still really need to know about Yhwach that I'm not sure we are ever going to get, and that's what became of him in the immediate aftermath of his battle with Yamamoto. Where did he go? How did he regress into a sealed state? Did the surviving Sternritter take his presumably comatose body into the new shadowy world they created immediately after? Although considering the Kaiser Gesang mentions that Yhwach regains his pulse, maybe he does actually die when he's sealed, maybe he was actually killed by Yamamoto at the end of their battle 1,000 years ago, but then that doesn't make sense either, as Mayuri calls Yamamoto out for not killing him. So I have to wonder, we have seen a brief flash of it in the anime so far, but in the moment Yamamoto brings his fiery sword down upon Yhwach, what happens next? Anyway, I ever so slightly prefer the manga's take on this scene. In the anime, we get a dramatic close-up of Yhwach's eye, which is cool, but I like the more underhanded and sinister smirk on his face as he gets a horrified reaction from Ichigo in the chapter. But as Ichigo breaks away from Yhwach and raises his sword to strike again, an arrow suddenly impales Yoruichi in the back, and everyone turns, looking on in horror as Uryū appears on the battlefield. Standing in silence, his cloak fluttering around him in the wind, Uryū coldly stares them down. I really love the choice of music here. The anime could have easily gone with a dramatic, more explosive, bombastic piece to signal Uryū's arrival, but instead, they play up the insidious sense of dread with a more suspenseful piece. Everyone turns to what they think is a familiar face, but in his actions, this appears to be an imposter. It can't be the Uryū they know. And now he's just shot Yoruichi in the back, a somewhat cowardly but all business move designed to break her concentration, and it works. As Yoruichi turns to Uryū, the seal around the Soul King cracks and splinters before exploding into tiny pieces, revealing the exposed Mimihagi once more. Again, this entire sequence is the exact same as the manga. The anime team has decided to keep Uryū's entrance the same, and I think that makes sense. And as I mentioned in my reaction, I do wonder how close Yoruichi was to actually completing her spell. As Ichigo snaps at Uryū, Yhwach suddenly appears behind him, striding towards the Soul King. And here is where I want to interject briefly to say, in all seriousness, what on earth are Chad, Orihime, and Ganju doing right now? Everyone's entire goal here is to prevent the Soul King from being killed, or at least being further damaged than he already is. So why are they standing so far away? Why is it that only Ichigo and Yoruichi attempt to stop Yhwach in this next sequence? Couldn't Orihime at least project a barrier between Yhwach and Mimihagi? That does annoy me a little bit, especially since the anime is actively trying to keep them involved, but it feels particularly obvious in this moment that they are just standing there doing nothing. I guess to be fair, it does feel like Chad can't really catch a break here. I make fun of him when he actually does try and get involved, and then I give him a good telling off when he doesn't seem to get involved at all, so really I don't know how he's supposed to win. Anyway, Ichigo turns back to Yhwach, but the Quincy King simply opens his hand and unleashes a powerful blast of blue energy that sends Ichigo flying backwards across the throne room. Yhwach does this here in the manga as well, and I always thought it was a bit odd. As far as I'm aware, we never see him using this power ever again, save for the 2 times he uses it here, against Ichigo and then Yoruichi in a moment. And honestly, it seems like it would be pretty handy to be able to literally blow people away with a mere flick of your hand. But approaching Mimihagi and towering over him in what's honestly a pretty creepy shot, Yhwach reaches for the Soul King once more, but he's suddenly struck by a string of spheres that burst into smoke on impact. Yoruichi reveals that whatever is hit by the first set of orbs will be instantly melted and disintegrated by the second, as she reveals another string. And again I have to ask, where are the others right now? Why aren't they helping Yoruichi or distracting Yhwach or doing anything? Even if they couldn't make a difference, it is odd that they aren't at least trying in the world's most dire hour of need. It was the same in the manga, but it feels more pronounced here for some reason, and I don't know if that is a side effect of already trying to involve them more or what, I have no idea. However, Yhwach is prepared. He calls upon Pernida Pankajaz, who, I guess, appears out of nowhere. To be honest, I never really thought about it as it is a very cool and ominous shot, but it is a bit strange that no one noticed Pernida's arrival. However, Pernida's eyes flash and it warps Yoruichi's outstretched arm, twisting the bones around in a spiral shape. It was interesting to see the silhouette of Yoruichi's arm being broken and snapped on the red background. That reminded me a lot of how the original anime would handle censorship. The main difference, though, is that in that example, the original anime would have likely lessened the outcome significantly too, whereas here the outcome is still the same as the manga. We see Yoruichi's brutalized arm in full as she looks on in terror. Before she can react, Yhwach blasts Yoruichi from the side of the palace, flinging her out into the expanse of space as she disappears from sight. Again, it's funny to see that Orihime just kind of reaches for her, despite Yoruichi being very far away at the time. And also, I'm a little surprised that Orihime doesn't try to save Yoruichi in that moment with a platform or something, unless it happens off-screen. Though in the manga, I believe it's never actually explained how Yoruichi survives and ends up on one of the floating cities. Anyway, Yhwach reaches Mimihagi once more and breaks the force field around it. Ichigo appears right behind the Quincy King, however, once again, Chad, Orihime and Ganju are completely absent and attempts to strike him. Instead, however, Uryū unleashes another arrow, this time aimed at Ichigo, who turns and shatters it to pieces in mid-air with his blade. As Yhwach praises Uryū, he destroys the force field and grabs Mimihagi with his bare hand, tearing it from the Soul King's crystal. As the shadowy hand is forcibly stripped away, the world begins to shake once again, and we find ourselves at the cliffhanger of chapter 619 as the Soul King's palace explodes, a powerful fissure opening up through the center of the fortress. This is the blast that I thought the anime was depicting back in episode 28 during Ichigo's new battle with Yhwach, but I was wrong, despite them looking oddly similar if you ask me. However, this is definitely the explosion depicted in the manga as it runs the full length of Reio's palace, splitting the very ground beneath their feet. Chad rescues Ganju as the palace breaks apart under them, which actually happens in the manga too, though I never noticed, but it's clear here at the start of chapter 620 that Ganju has 1 foot over the side. At the same time, Pernida topples from the palace as the ground shatters beneath it. I always thought this was meant to be a slight hint towards Pernida's true identity. The fact that it doesn't have legs means it wasn't capable of stabilizing itself at all and simply fell off the side. We've finally reached the meat of the episode, however long into this review. In the manga, this is where Uryū truly gets involved, but it's also where we can now see the failings of his portrayal here in the source material, best in the cold light of the anime. In the manga, he actively darts between Yhwach and Ichigo, lifting his bow and telling them that if any of them move, he'll shoot. Of course, defiant as he is, Ichigo rushes Uryū anyway and his former friend looses a second arrow at him, but Ichigo destroys it in mid-flight once again, and the two of them finally get a moment to talk. Let's jump back over to the anime here. In the episode, the drama is heightened greatly. Ichigo and Uryū find themselves separated from the others, raised up upon an arena all their own. Uryū warns Ichigo not to interfere with Yhwach in a line carried over from the end of chapter 619, and then the rest of the sequence plays out effectively the same as the manga. Remember, this is the first time Ichigo and the others have actually had the chance to face off with Uryū properly since discovering he's seemingly turned against them. But what makes the anime's version so powerful before the fight even begins is the fact that we've spent time with Uryū since in a big way. I was wondering if the anime would address his killing of Senjumaru at all, but I guess there's really no reason to bring it up, unless someone like Yhwach did, for example. Even so, at this point in the manga, Uryū has done, well, nothing at all. So I think we all went into this showdown with heightened expectations and left, I'd say, mostly disappointed by their non-fight. Here in the anime, we came into this moment high off the anime's continued transformation of Uryū, and at least I did, with the expectation that Uryū would also get a proper battle with Ichigo this time around. And thankfully the anime has really delivered in every way possible with this character so far. In another exchange that is identical to the manga version, Ichigo finally gets the chance to ask Uryū just what on earth is going on. Ichigo asks Uryū if he knows why they are here, to which Uryū says that he won't let them stop Yhwach's plan. When Ichigo screams that if Yhwach succeeds, the world of the living, the Soul Society, and Hueco Mundo will all be destroyed, Uryū callously notes that he's already aware of that. In my opinion, it's in this next moment where the anime really shines. While the dialogue is the same as the chapter, the sheer trembling disbelief in Ichigo's voice as he tries to come to terms with the fact that Uryū knows what will become of the worlds and yet still fights alongside the enemy absolutely elevates this scene for me in a huge way. More than that though, it validates the reason for their fight, as we talked about at the start of this review. Ichigo's desperate attempts to understand Uryū come through crystal clear here, and yet he is met with a cold indifference each time. It's more obvious than ever that Ichigo was perhaps hoping that Uryū was just misguided, or that he didn't have all the facts. But instead, Ichigo comes face to face with the horrifying revelation, and what seems to be on the surface nothing but cold, calculating, impossible evil. When Ichigo asks why Uryū is standing on their side despite everything, Uryū attempts to justify his actions by stating that he's a Quincy, nothing more. That's good stuff, and it feels so completely different to the manga version in my opinion, despite ostensibly being the same. I always felt weird about this conversation when I read the chapter back in the day. It was about what I had expected them to say to each other, but it still felt unsatisfying. It felt like a big, glaring chunk of it was missing, like Ichigo was just shouting at a wall and receiving nothing back, and maybe that was the idea, that we as readers were meant to feel that same frustration that Ichigo does. Anyway, it's time to split once again from the source material as things are changed up in a very big way here. And so, as we normally do, let's start by looking at the manga's version of events, as everything is over a lot faster there. As Ichigo is aghast by Uryū's words, the Schutzstaffel arrive on the scene, floating down with their fluffy angelic wings. The same wings they gained upon being resurrected by the Auswählen, and the same wings that were cut from the anime. To be honest, while them gaining those wings in the immediate aftermath of the Auswählen kind of made sense, them having them here never really did. As the Schutzstaffel surround Orihime, Chad, and Ganju, Uryū tells them he doesn't need their help, and calls them the Schutzstaffel for the very first time in the manga. As he does, Uryū fires several arrows at Ichigo's feet, destroying the ground beneath his former friend, and sending him falling from the palace. Watching Ichigo fall, Lil Barrow decides to snipe him and finish him off. However, before he can, in perhaps the manga's most obvious display of Uryū's true intentions yet, Uryū gets in there quickly and fires an arrow directly at Ichigo instead. When Lil turns to Uryū, suspicious of his motives, Uryū claims to know what Lil is thinking, before noting that they can't survive this fall anyway. Bellowing with laughter, Gerard takes Uryū's side, perhaps in the nick of time, and officially welcomes him into the Schutzstaffel. And with that, the showdown in the royal palace comes to an end in the manga. Ichigo and Yoruichi have both fallen from the palace itself, and while we don't know what became of Chad, Orihime, and Ganju, well, we can fairly safely assume they lost to the Schutzstaffel. The anime is, of course, much different, and all that follows here is essentially completely new, which I want to reiterate once again. With Uryū's stance known to them all, the two of them face off, the music slowly ramping up. Uryū says that if they want to reach Yhwach, they'll have to do so over his dead body. A straightforward and final message to Ichigo, one he knows Ichigo will never accept. On the other side, Ichigo reluctantly readies his blade. At this point, it really feels like the anime knew that we were all waiting for this. After their non-fight in the manga, now was the time. What you've seen of Uryū so far in the anime in regards to his clashes with Ichigo and the others is pretty much all we ever received in the manga. After this, they have a very short fight, if you can even call it that, in Varvel. But by that point, we already effectively knew that Uryū was a turncoat, with Hashwolf basically spelling it out for us. Now though, this is Uryū's chance to really show us who he is. But before that, the Schutzstaffel arrive just as they do in the manga, except here they have got the basic versions of their actual Vollständig active once again. Gerard has picked up Pernida and brought them back to the palace, a really lovely little moment of camaraderie between the villains that I'm glad the anime kept in. As Gerard mocks Orihime, Chad and Ganju with a line from the manga, noting that while he figured they'd be a huge army, he's instead disappointed to find only foot soldiers, Ganju snaps back at Gerard, telling him that they're an army all by themselves. Honestly, Ganju yelling at extremely powerful villains is becoming one of my new favourite inclusions, and it makes him being here worth it for that alone. Anyway, as Ganju tells Chad and Orihime to ready themselves, we cut back to the main event, and perhaps some of the nicest animation I have ever seen in the 1000-Year Blood War arc anime to date. Ichigo rushes Uryū, the Quincy firing multiple arrows at his friends as they are surrounded by a tempest of dust and smoke. Ichigo deflects each arrow in a flurry of blue and gold sparks before leaping up into the air, preparing to bring his sword down upon Uryū. In what may very well be one of the most satisfying looking sequences in the anime to date, Ichigo pressures Uryū, who deactivates his bow and swiftly dodges Ichigo's first strike. With his bow gone, Uryū instead whips his arm up to Ichigo's face and unleashes a volley of arrows as if flinging them from his hand as though they are a set of knives or something, bringing his other arm around in an arc as well, releasing a second wave of blue light. As Ichigo manages to duck and weave out of the way, Uryū twists around and, kicking outwards with his foot, sends a third stream of arrows towards Ichigo. Shocked that Uryū can fire arrows without his bow now, Ichigo drives his shoulder into Uryū, the two former friends almost back to back once again, before Uryū leaps into the air, narrowly avoiding another of Ichigo's slashes. In the sky above, Uryū draws leaked Reigen again, but this time with nothing but his hands, sending a rainfall of crystalline blue light down upon Ichigo, the ground turning to rubble beneath him and dropping Ichigo to the floor below. Gathering himself from beneath rocks and debris, Ichigo is startled by an arrow that emerges from the darkness behind him. As he leaps to avoid it, several more arrows come bursting up from the ground around Ichigo, forcing him to sprint away, blue explosions peppering the path left behind him. With his attention on those blasts at the back, Ichigo runs headfirst into another arrow from the front, one that Uryū fires at him from below. The arrow catches Ichigo on the face but is deflected away from him in a display of glittering sparks. Uryū is shocked to see blue vein spreading instinctively across Ichigo's face, and when the realization sets in, he's seemingly horrified. Let's take a break for a moment to discuss this, as it's a pretty big deal. In the manga, as far as we know, Uryū really had no idea about Ichigo's Quincy heritage, his connection to the Ishida family, or anything like that. Here, with Uryū seeing Ichigo's blue vein with his own eyes, that's more than we received in the entirety of the manga, and you can only imagine what flits through Uryū's mind in this split second. Right here and now, Uryū realizes that Ichigo is at least part Quincy. A huge revelation, and Uryū is smart enough to likely put two and two together, realizing that if Ichigo's father is a Shinigami, then where does the Quincy side come from? I do wonder how deep this new knowledge will go. Will Uryū likely realise that Ichigo's mother suffered a similar fate to his? Another nice little point to consider is that every time Ichigo's blue vein seems to instinctively activate, we can interpret that as Old Man Zangetsu coming to Ichigo's defense. Anyway, Uryū's momentary lapse in concentration allows Ichigo to get the better of him. Ichigo slings a Getsuga Tensho at Uryū, blasting a hole in the palace wall and knocking Uryū down. I believe this is the first ever time Uryū has been struck by a Getsuga Tensho, which is obviously pretty crazy too. However, with Uryū on the ground, Ichigo now has him pinned. Ichigo points his Zanpakuto at Uryū before grabbing him by the folds of his uniform and hoisting him upwards. By the way, I just want to interject again briefly here. In the manga, we only ever received one panel of Ichigo and Uryū actually clashing, and it was during their brief skirmish in Varvelt. But that panel alone was so impactful in the sense that it encapsulated their conflict, as lacking as it was, but it almost all felt worth it for the sake of that one shot. Actually seeing Ichigo and Uryū locking weapons. Here, though, I mean, it's crazy how much the ante has been upped already. What I will say is this. There are some elements of the 1000-Year Blood War arc that I still prefer in the manga. Or sometimes I think maybe the manga portrayed it better or paced it better, but when it comes to the Uryū scenes, I'm not sure I'll ever be able to look at them the same way again. The anime is just far, far superior in almost every way in regards to this central conflict between these characters, and that's only going to increase as we continue on with this review. Anyway, Ichigo, with a palpable rage on his face, tells Uryū to stop messing around, to which Uryū replies that Ichigo is the one doing that, as he had the perfect chance to kill him right then and there. Ichigo says that of course he would never do that, but Uryū tells him that this world doesn't need Shinigami, before his entire body is suddenly covered in blood, his veins all glowing a powerful blue light. This is an interesting line to give Uryū in the sense that it doesn't really make any sense at all, and he presumably knows that. The world absolutely does need Shinigami for the sake of the balance. Were it just Quincy, the balance would be destroyed. But perhaps that's the point. The anime is trying to show that Uryū fully believes in Yhwach's vision of a world without death. Suddenly, however, Uryū disappears in a massive but familiar column of blue light as he activates his Quincy Vollständig for the first time. Yes, the anime continues to give us everything we could have possibly wanted, while at the same time continuing to highlight the frankly gaping and baffling holes left in the manga. As the gleaming pillar of power explodes into shards around him, Uryū is revealed in his brand new form, and it looks fantastic. It's a simple design, which I really enjoy, reminding me the most of the Sclaverai-empowered holy forms of the likes of Robert and the Bambis. It's not quite on the level of Kirige's, I would say, and it's certainly not as warped as something like Asnod's either. In that sense, it is perfect for Uryū, understated but sleek and efficient. His wings are now fully formed, taking on a rigid crystal blue appearance, with a split in the middle of them that makes them look segmented almost. Uryū now has a pair of glittering gauntlets and boots, each of which take on an arrow motif, and he has that same arrow as a badge over his heart too. As the church bells ring out, Uryū is revealed in all his angelic splendour, and I have to say that I am very happy with this. It also gives new context to Ichigo's earlier conversation with Kirige, where he talks about Uryū possibly transforming into something as ugly as that. But it's also entirely possible that Uryū's Vollständig isn't entirely complete yet, as it doesn't have a name, nor does it have a halo either. Now, that's interesting in its own right. A name I can understand, but no halo is odd, as that removes Uryū's ability to use Sclaverai entirely. Is that just a sign that his Vollständig is still incredibly new? And yet, it already has more detailing than the most basic versions of other Vollständig that seem to need Sclaverai to achieve this look. Perhaps then, with more refining, Uryū could reach a stage where he can just call out his wings in a basic form like they can too. Also, speaking of how new Uryū's power is, it's kind of crazy to consider just how fast he's evolving. The almost accidental activation of Uryū's Vollständig occurred during his fight with Senjumaru, which, I mean, it can't have even been an hour ago in universe. I mean, we don't know how long it was between Ichibe's death and Ichigo's arrival into the palace, but I seriously doubt it was much longer than an hour or two. So in that time, Uryū has somehow gained a fully formed Vollständig. Regardless, there can be no doubt now that Uryū is actually showcasing his power, and I love that. As Uryū tells Ichigo that he will show him his resolve, we get to see the principal ability of Uryū's Vollständig too. He can conjure a flock of arrows that soar around him like birds, or perhaps more fittingly, missiles or maybe even drones. These arrows, of which there appear to be hundreds if not more, are controlled by Uryū's hands in a manner very similar to the likes of Byakuya's Bankai Senbonzakura Kageyoshi. I also wonder if it's maybe a small reference to the Zanpakuto of Jirobo Ikanzaka, which is Sunzaki Garasu, the Shinigami that Uryū fights early in the Soul Society arc, who has a fairly similar Shikai to this power, but of course Uryū completely destroys it. Again, it's a slick power and one that's very fitting for Uryū. A meticulous, detail-oriented person, one who has shown great skill with his hands in the past, as evidenced by his sewing proficiency. But perhaps best of all, I love that the entire thing is themed around arrows. It's just perfect for the character who has embodied the Quincy for the entire story to date. Way back when, before we knew what Uryū's Shrift was, I predicted that his A would be the arrow. It seemed pretty obvious to me. While I was wrong, it's nice to see that even among the crazy powers of the Sternritter, including his own, Uryū is still the series' biggest advocate for the arrow itself. Anyway, as Uryū draws his fleet of arrows around him in a huge ring, we then cut back to the Serete as everyone continues to look on at Ukitake's grotesque form. In a new scene, Akon, Hyosu, and Kuna note that the Sutra scale is showing alarming readings once again, indicating the boundaries between the three worlds are breaking apart, just as they were doing at the very start of the arc when the Quincy's were killing Hollows en masse. However, Kisuke notes that they instead need to be worrying about the stability of the Soul King, as Ukitake attempting to hold the worlds together on his own is going to be extremely hard on his body. It's a bit of a weird scene, this one. I'm not really sure what it adds. Of course, the boundaries between the worlds are going to be struggling right now, and we've already gone through much of this before in last week's episode. I think the idea is that the Shinigami are meant to be realising that Mimihagi hasn't quite worked, but still, it's odd. Anyway, back in the palace above, Hashwolf watches Uryū's transformation in secret from on high, clearly suspicious of him and the new power he's gaining. It does make me laugh that Hashwolf's role in this episode is just to stare ominously as the camera pans in on his face, but I mean, he does it pretty well. As Ichigo asks Uryū about his new form, Uryū unleashes his arrows. In a surprise twist, however, the arrows transform, a fearsome-looking spike protruding from the tip of each of them as they zip towards Ichigo. Now becoming bows unto themselves, the arrows begin blasting Ichigo with more arrows of their own, and he attempts to cut them down, slashing and deflecting their blasts. Uryū, controlling the arrows with his hand, overwhelms Ichigo, striking him several times with shots from his army of drones, essentially. The individual hits don't seem to be too powerful as Ichigo takes the full brunt of numerous shots to his torso, but the idea is that Uryū can quickly engulf someone in blasts. One strike does land true, however, spearing Ichigo's hand and causing him to drop his small sword. In another very nice little move, however, Ichigo doubles back, flipping over to grab the sword, then turning tail and running, unleashing a golden Getsuga Tensho at the back wall before escaping through it in an attempt to take the fight outside. Ichigo flees from Uryū's arrow onslaught as we return to the other battle currently taking place. In another totally new sequence, we actually get to see Chad, Orihime, and Ganju taking on the Schutzstaffel, which is a fantastic surprise. Ganju leaps into the air and unleashes a litany of fireworks in an ability called the Shiba-style shooting flower Senpen Banka, not to be confused with Ganju's bankai, and the fireworks explode in front of the Schutzstaffel, showering them in a delightfully coloured display of sparks. I'm not being entirely facetious here either, this is a really nice shot. But Gerard is not in the mood for fireworks, calling it a pathetic ability before swinging his blade. The sheer force unleashed from Gerard's sword dispels the fireworks and hurtles towards Ganju, but Orihime leaps in the way and blocks the blast with a barrier, deflecting Gerard's power up into the air. Grinning, Gerard readies another strike, but Chad comes rushing in. I'll be honest, and this isn't a joke, but I'm not entirely sure what Chad's doing here. Gerard's first shockwave was already deflected by Orihime, and Chad then seemingly rushes him before he has a chance to swing again. Unless the idea is that Gerard does swing his sword a second time there, and this time it is now Chad who goes on to block the gust of wind with his fist. Either way, we're at the stage now where Chad is literally punching the air. What's next, statues? Still, again, I'm grateful to see them actually getting involved, no matter what it sounds like, and realistically they don't stand a chance against the Schutzstaffel. However, just to give you an idea of how powerful this force is that both Chad and Orihime just contended with, before he was powered up by the Auswählen, the force of Gerard's sword strike alone, again, just the gust of wind like we saw here, was capable of leaving a massive imprint on Hikefune's Cage of Life. That, but even stronger now, is what they just blocked, and to be honest, that's actually kind of impressive. Askin mockingly says that he's scared, while Leal remarks that they are being underestimated if Ganju really thought his firework trick would work. However, Ganju reveals that was all just a setup for the main course. Slamming his hands onto the ground, Ganju activates Renkan Seppa Sen, creating a massive bowl of quicksand that ensnares the Schutzstaffel. I believe this is the same ability he uses to drop Yumachika into the pit during the Soul Society arc, but either way, it works. The Schutzstaffel are all dragged beneath the sand, with Pernida in particular surely suffering some flashbacks to Senjumaru's bankai. The idea seems to be to drop the Schutzstaffel from the royal palace as the sand creates a huge hole in the floor, potentially giving Ganju the most impressive multi-kill ever when we consider how strong he is compared to them. This isn't a Senjumaru situation, people, this is Ganju. I mentioned in my reaction that I love the way Ganju just asks Chad and Orihime if he was badass, to which Orihime just, sort of nods. However, in actuality, of course, it doesn't work. The sand itself comes rushing back up again as the Schutzstaffel fly upwards, utilising their wings to soar up into the sky above. To Ganju's credit, Leal compliments him, acknowledging that his strategy was well played. Also, I feel it's worth saying that the Schutzstaffel needed to activate their basic Vollständig to survive Ganju in the first place, so there's that. We then return to the Soul King. As Yhwach attempts to reach his exposed crystal, Mimihagi suddenly leaps back into action, springing upon Yhwach and defending the king with a crackle of golden lightning. Down below, Ukitake's body continues to twitch and spasm, the gathered Shinigami realizing that he's still fighting. Honestly, this is a new detail that I am a massive fan of. It gives Ukitake some agency where previously he had none at all. The idea that Ukitake himself is actually helping Mimihagi up above is excellent and makes Ukitake feel even more vital to the operation than he did before. You get the sense that he's really giving it his all, plus it helps to demonstrate his immense power. Ukitake, along with Mimihagi, are holding back Yhwach himself for some time. When Sentaro wonders if there's anything they can do to help Ukitake, Isane runs forward, adamant that Ukitake needs to stop as he can't keep this up. Now, this isn't the best look for Isane in my opinion. It's already been established that not only is this what Ukitake wants, but also that he is currently the only thing holding the world together. So, what exactly did Isane think she was going to achieve by trying to break the link? Ukitake is also a dead man walking essentially, but I mean, I get it. Maybe she sees another captain dying, and thinking back to Unohana, doesn't want to lose anyone else, and in the moment, doesn't really see sense. Plus, it leads to the nice little new moment where her sister Kione takes her arm and shakes her head, fighting back tears. And in fact, I never really thought about that before. Both Kotetsu sisters end up losing their captain, and both realise they have to be strong enough to let it happen. In that sense, I almost wish the roles were reversed in this scene. Imagine if Kione decided that she couldn't bear it anymore and tried to intervene, but Isane, having already experienced the loss of Unohana, was the one to stop her. That would have been pretty nice, I think. Anyway, we return to the palace and see Mimihagi's eye widening, and in this moment it actually seems to be overpowering Yhwach. Meanwhile, Ichigo continues to evade Uryū's arrows in another just wonderfully animated sequence. Now that he's out in the open, Ichigo finds himself with a little more freedom, and he darts around, occasionally turning to destroy several of the oncoming arrows with an explosive Getsuga. Presumably he's using the more defensive Getsuga that we saw him block Sankt Morgen with a couple of episodes back, but this time it's very much on the fly. And Uryū's arrows now are moving so fast and in such a rapid motion that they appear to be almost blue lasers. Here we get even more dialogue between the two of them as well, the kind of dialogue that really fleshes out this conflict, ultimately making it much more believable and satisfying than what we got in the manga. Uryū confesses that, yes, he once thought that Quincy's and Shinigami could live side by side, the same belief held by his grandfather Soken. However, that's just no longer the case. Uryū notes that their grudge goes back 1,000 years, and Yhwach waited for the moment he knew would come, all while the Shinigami massacred the Quincy's left behind, including none other than Soken himself. It kind of looks like Ichigo uses Getsuga Jūjishō here, as when he emerges from the fireball it dissolves into that familiar golden cross, but I'm not entirely sure. Either way, Uryū tells Ichigo that it was always the Quincy whose blood was spilled, and crucially, he cannot forgive the one who took everything from him. Before we continue with the fight, there are a couple of things to look at of note here. A couple of fleeting moments that possibly betray Uryū's true nature. The first one is one that I'm not so sure about. After Ichigo uses a Getsuga to destroy a number of Uryū's arrows in an enormous explosion, Uryū smirks. It kind of comes out of nowhere, and I'm conflicted over what it's actually meant to mean. Is it a quick grin from Uryū to highlight how pleased he is to see Ichigo's new true power before hiding back under his facade again? Or are we just supposed to think that he believes he landed the hit on Ichigo and he's happy about that? Because the second possibility doesn't really make sense to me. Uryū has no reason to smile about that, as he doesn't actually want to hurt Ichigo. Also, he continues monologuing to Ichigo anyway, so he can't think that he's in too bad shape. It's a bit of a weird one, this, and I'd like to know what you think of that blink and you'll miss it shot of Uryū's grin. But the more clear-cut moment is, of course, when Uryū declares to Ichigo that he can't forgive the one who took everything from him. There's absolutely only one person that Uryū can be talking about here, Yhwach. Yhwach killed Uryū's mother in the same way he killed Ichigo's, and so that is who Uryū can't forgive. The way he words his earlier story is quite interesting too. He says Yhwach waited for a moment he knew would come while the Quincy who were left behind were massacred. While the Shinigami clearly aren't blameless here, the way this is worded to me makes it sound like Uryū believes Yhwach abandoned the rest of the Quincy to their fates, all while sitting around and waiting for his time to come, despite being their king. Certain Quincy were left behind, while the Vandenreich was allowed to flourish in secret. Anyway, that's just my conspiracy theories coming to bear. The fight continues, and we get to see the intricacies of Uryū's new power on display. Controlling a combination of actual arrows and his arrowhead drones, Uryū entraps Ichigo within a sphere construct before detonating the entire thing, the resulting explosion taking the shape of a Quincy cross in a great little touch. Returning to the battle with the Schutzstaffel, Gerard tells them that if they won't attack, he will take them all on at once. And of course, we know the worse Gerard's odds, the greater his power of the miracle will be. That being said, I'm not entirely sure his odds are really that bad here. Of course, Askin chimes in, telling Gerard to go ahead, and landing before Chad, Orihime, and Ganju, Gerard draws his sword once more and swings at them all in a wide arc. But Chad activates Brazo Derecha del Gigante, conjuring his shield arm seemingly just in time to block Gerard's sword. But all three of them are sent flying backwards, and we don't see them again for the remainder of the episode. It kind of looks like the three of them are sent flying off the side of the palace too, following Yoruichi, but the episode doesn't do a great job of showing that. Either way, if we discover that Chad is basically unharmed despite taking Gerard's actual sword to his shield arm, then that will again be fairly impressive to see. Back to the other fight once more, and Ichigo emerges from the smoke of the explosion, again mostly unharmed, but Uryū asks him where his honor is. Holding out his hand, Uryū gathers blue energy before him, generating what looks like a massive arrow, where the arrowhead itself takes the shape of a gigantic Quincy cross. Again, it's very refreshing to see such prominent Quincy iconography like this used in a battle by someone that's not called Yhwach or Kirge, and perhaps that's another reason why a fight like this is so good and so important to see. Many of the Sternritter seem to have strayed away from what it originally meant to be a Quincy in more ways than one. So to see Uryū, who is now a major antagonist of the arc, actually fighting like this really makes it feel like a true Shinigami versus Quincy duel, even if the Shinigami in question is using Blute every now and then. In response, Ichigo coats his blades in golden Reiatsu before unleashing Getsuga Jūjishō once again, the enormous cross-shaped blast spiraling towards Uryū with all the fury of the sun itself. Uryū then releases his new attack, Sternenstaub, meaning stardust, firing it towards the oncoming Getsuga Jūjishō. Their attacks collide, a tumultuous mix of gold and blue, the clash so powerful that it sends a rolling tidal shockwave barreling across the entire plain of the royal palace, the two shimmering lights visible from far away. Uryū's arrowhead drones seem to be spilling from Sternenstaub itself as Getsuga Jūjishō bears down upon it, and it's clear as the collision comes to an end in a blinding light that Ichigo's attack has unequivocally overpowered Uryū's. And yet, with Sternenstaub dispersed, Getsuga Jūjishō just soars cleanly past Uryū before disappearing into the sky. Ichigo seemingly missed his attack on purpose, leaving Uryū to call him naive. We then see Yhwach continuing to be pressured by Mimihagi's overwhelming presence, but it almost feels like Yhwach's gaze is elsewhere. Could it be that he is looking to see what Uryū does next at this critical juncture? Speaking of which, Uryū then draws one last arrow, telling Ichigo that he won't let him kill Yhwach, perhaps because Uryū wants to be the one to do it in the future. Ichigo continues to seem dumbfounded by everything that's occurring, as though he's been fighting on autopilot, unable to truly draw his weapon against Uryū. However, in this final moment, the screen darkens, turning black and white, Shinigami against Quincy. Nothing else exists in this space aside from the two of them. Ichigo seems to want to say something but is barely able to choke the words out. Uryū lifts his bow, and in response, Ichigo lifts his swords. It does kind of look like he's preparing to activate bankai here, but it's hard to say for sure. Regardless, he doesn't get the chance. In a moment that is framed in a very similar fashion to when Uryū delivered Senjumaru the fatal shot through her heart, he fires an arrow at Ichigo as well. One single silvery arrow that cuts through the dark and lands. In a truly shocking development, a totally new culmination of this showdown in the palace, Uryū blasts Ichigo through the side, resulting in a massive gaping hole in Ichigo's body. Barely able to speak his friend's name, Ichigo drops out of the sky, plummeting into the clouds far below. Wow, I mean, that is a crazy conclusion. I certainly didn't see it coming, but when you think about it, it was the logical endpoint. I've said it before that Uryū killing Senjumaru was an enormous deal, make no mistake, but how the anime would choose to depict him in battle against Ichigo would really seal the deal. Would they commit as much as they possibly could, at least? And well, the answer, it turns out, is yes. But of course, it's not that simple. There is more going on here than meets the eye. And Uryū's killing of Senjumaru is a good place to start. While Ichigo wasn't immobilized like Senjumaru, it is pretty clear that Uryū could have made the same shot and punched an arrow through Ichigo's heart with no issue, and yet he didn't. He delivered Ichigo a devastating-looking wound, absolutely, but ultimately in the world of Bleach, one that is very unlikely to be fatal. It doesn't even look as bad as Kira's injury in the first invasion. Uryū also knows that Orihime is around, so it seems a safe bet to me that she will be enlisted to save Ichigo's life next week. So, what actually happened here? Well, Uryū did enough to convince the Schutzstaffel that he is on their side, as Gerard, much like in the manga, congratulates Uryū on his victory. Or at least, he's almost done enough. For one member of the Schutzstaffel still doesn't trust him. As Haschwalth gazes knowingly down at Uryū, Uryū meets his eyes just in time for the title of the Betrayer to flash up on the screen. Who, then, is betraying whom in this scenario? Is it Uryū's attack on Ichigo and his friends, or is it the truth that Haschwalth speculates, that Uryū is in fact working against them? While convincing, Uryū's final decision to spare Ichigo may ultimately prove to be his undoing in the end, but we'll just have to see. Tell you what though, with all this new content for Uryū, with all of these new abilities and powers, I simply cannot wait to see how his fight with Haschwalth unfolds in part 4. I think it's going to be dramatically different. But there you have it, that was Ichigo versus Uryū. It is an incredible showdown, brought to life in spectacular fashion, and really, I couldn't be happier. Part 3 is looking to be, honestly, the best season of the 1000-Year Blood War arc yet, with all these new additions. Uryū as a character is completely transformed as a result of this episode if he wasn't already. But there's nuance here too. It's obvious that for as powerful as Uryū has become, and he has, and he's been given numerous chances now to prove it in front of his colleagues, Ichigo is still much stronger. Not only was Ichigo holding back for the most part, but the majority of Uryū's attacks barely injured him, save for that final one. Getsuga Jūjishō overwhelmed Sternenstaub, and the rest is obvious. The end of their battle definitely seemed to harken back to how Uryū defeated Mayuri, including the idea that perhaps he wasn't actually shooting to kill. But the episode isn't over yet, as we have another additional scene at the end of the episode after the credits. Taking us to the end of chapter 620, we see Yhwach continuing to battle Mimihagi. However, compared with the original chapter, Mimihagi definitely seems far more threatening here in the anime. At this point in the manga, Mimihagi is barely holding on, and tries to attack Yhwach by surprise, only to be instantly swatted away, annihilated by the king. Here in the anime, Mimihagi actually manages to enclose around Yhwach, but in a demonstration of his power, Yhwach merely grabs Mimihagi by the eye and just tears him apart. It's a savage scene, especially when Ukitake's body lurches violently down in the serete below. With Mimihagi dissipating into the wind, Yhwach calls upon his children now to give him everything that they are in another totally new sequence. Each member of the Schutzstaffel generates a reishi broadsword before themselves and holds it aloft. Pernida just kind of hovers the sword. I assume it's using its nerves to do so, and from the swords themselves, a great power is bestowed upon Yhwach. And I do love the imagery on show here, despite them all having such different designs. While each of them holds one of these broadswords, they do appear like an order of knights, which I think is very awesome. But from the blades of the Schutzstaffel, a new sword is created in Yhwach's own hand, one that combines all of their strength. With this all-powerful weapon, Yhwach brings it down upon the Soul King one final time, splitting and cracking his already ruined crystal. Perhaps this is what he meant by needing Ichigo to break the seal of Reio, allowing the crystal itself to now be attacked by anyone. With Reio's crystal prison fractured in another shocking moment to cap off the episode, the crystal breaks apart entirely, revealing Adnias himself for the very first time. Interestingly, when Reio's severed lower half is lifted upwards, we can quite clearly see it is completely hollow. So it does appear that absolutely everything was carved out of the Soul King at one point. And so even then, just this outer shell, this hollow husk of Reio, had enough power to decimate all three worlds. In this moment, Yhwach absorbs the Soul King entirely, taking everything that he is in an effort to restore the world to how it should be. Now, if you've read the manga, you'll realise that at the end of the episode here, things go a bit off the rails. This is completely different to how things play out in the original chapters. So, in the manga, when Yhwach destroys Mimihagi, perhaps out of spite or anger or resentment towards the fact that the right arm turned against him, he decides to absorb Mimihagi itself, taking the right arm for his own, to the point where one half of his entire body is covered in the same eerie black markings that once covered Ukitake. After this, Yhwach then decides, pretty much on the fly, to absorb Reio. And it's by doing so that he prevents the worlds from collapsing right there and then. It always seemed like Yhwach absorbing Reio was actually antithetical to his original goal, as by doing so he basically created a new Soul King, thereby preventing the collapse of the worlds. Here, the anime is taking a slightly different approach. Yhwach mentions restoring the world to how it should be, implying here that absorbing Reio is actually a part of his wider goal. Presumably the anime is going to explain that Yhwach actually needs the immense power of Reio to reshape the worlds in the first place. And in a new moment, Yhwach seems to feel the power swelling within him as suddenly an enormous blue tornado explodes and swirls around him. When the dust settles, Yhwach is down on one knee, his face hidden from view. And here is where things are very different once again. I mentioned at the start of this video that this episode included snippets of both Chapter 621, The Dark Curtain, and Chapter 626, The Holy Newborn, but in reality, they really are barely in the episode at all. However, this shot of Yhwach crumpled over is taken from Chapter 621 as he struggles to absorb the Soul King completely. And look how different it is. Notice how in the panel shown, Reio's body is still clearly visible too. But then immediately after this shot of Yhwach in the anime, the very final shot of the episode shows that he now bears the eldritch eyes of the Soul King upon his face, something that doesn't happen until chapter 626, which shouldn't be taking place until maybe next week, if not the week after, because Yhwach only gains those all-seeing eyes after he totally absorbs the Soul King, which in the manga is split into 2 parts essentially, but here in the anime it seems to all be happening at the same time. Anyway, we end with the poem for next week's episode, and this time it's being read by Aizen, which is exciting, and it reads, "To those who know not the absence of power, look toward the sky with your shattered ego. The one sky that no one could enter until the king was roused from his slumber." It's a very cool poem in my opinion, very fitting for Aizen, and I think it is likely referencing this one scene from chapter 624, I think it is, where Kyoraku talks with Aizen about everyone heading to the royal palace, to which Aizen notes that the one who prevented him from getting there has actually reached the royal palace before him after all, meaning none other than Ichigo of course, and the seeming resentment that someone like Aizen felt about that fact. And I always thought that this scene was very ominous and was hinting that Aizen would eventually be the main villain again by the end, as he was clearly still very unhappy about not having reached the palace, and even more unhappy about the fact that Ichigo was already there. But it never came to be. And of course, next week's episode is episode 31, titled Against the Judgment. And well, with that, we finished another episode. This was another long one, but how could I not take a truly detailed look at Ichigo versus Uryū, perhaps one of the main events we've all been hoping to see since this 1000-year Blood War arc anime began. But it definitely looks like we'll be going to some crazy places next week. In fact, I'm very excited for episode 31. It's likely to feature the coming together of a lot of characters from all corners of the Bleach universe. Aizen, the remaining Sternritter, and possibly even Ganju, as everyone prepares to head towards the royal palace, the entire arc coalescing and culminating in one place for the final showdown. Kyoraku is likely to be a star player of next week as well, as he attempts to justify freeing Aizen, and we should get one of his coolest speeches in the entire series. The character interactions should also be fantastic. Speaking of Ganju, I have a feeling his appearance will be the cliffhanger of the episode, though I have to wonder what new content we might get, if any, next time. Episode 31 should be a fairly plot-heavy episode now that the showdown in the Royal Palace is officially over, and I can't wait to see it. As always, we've received some preview images for the episode which I took a look at, and while most of them aren't particularly enlightening, there are 2 that drew my attention. The first one is this shot of the Sternritter from chapter 623 showing Sternritter Yu Nanana Najacoup. Now, isn't that interesting? Nanana, in episode 25, was struck by the Auswählen, along with a bunch of other characters, as we recently discussed in our last Club Outside video. And then, Nanana received a death art from Kubo, and yet next week he is going to be alive and well. So that's really rather intriguing to me. Does that mean that everyone else who received a death art is still alive? Can this Meninus Robert? Somehow I seriously doubt it. I would like some kind of confirmation about Robert's status either way, but I've got no idea, to be totally honest. It does kind of look like Nanana might get his big moment with Aizen, but again, I'm not entirely sure. Perhaps even more interesting, in my opinion, however, is the picture of Mayuri. At first glance, I mistakenly thought the device that Mayuri is holding was the same thing he used to electrocute the zombie Urankar, and so I thought the zombie Urankar might be making a surprise reappearance here in episode 31, as we don't ever see them again in the source material after the fight with Giselle. However, it's not that device. Instead, it kind of looks similar to the detonator that Mayuri uses in his fight with Pernida, so to be honest, I'm not entirely sure what's going on here, what this device is, what it means, but it could be that Mayuri is blowing something up. That sounds about right for him, to be fair. Alright guys, that's it for the video today. As always, I really do hope you enjoyed it. Again, I apologise it's such a long one. I really do hope you liked it though. Regardless, I hope you took something of value away from it. Let me know in the comments what you thought of episode 30 of the 1000 Year Blood War arc titled The Betrayer. Did you enjoy it? What do you think of Ichigo versus Uryū's fight now that we finally have it? Did you like it? Do you like Uryū's Vollständig? Everything like that. Let me know all of your thoughts down in the comments below. Let me know your predictions for next week's episode as well. As always, I'd love to hear it. And I want to end the video, as we always do, by saying a massive thank you and giving a huge shout out to my wonderful supporters over on Patreon, without whom I simply wouldn't be able to keep doing this. If you like what I do here over on YouTube and you want to take support from me on a step further, thank you. By following the link in my description below or visiting patreon.com/MrTomo2304, you too can support me and my work as well at whatever tier you feel is fitting. By supporting me at the $1 tier a month, you can get your name in the credits of every single video just like this, and at the $2 tier or higher, you can get every single video I release absolutely free of baked-in YouTube ads. Alright everyone, but that's it from me. Once again, thank you so very much for watching. Until next time, I'll catch you later, and I'll see you then.